The wind in this part of the territory had teeth. It was a mean, biting thing that gnawed at the seams of Clara's small cabin, a constant reminder of how close to the edge of the world she lived. The cabin itself, perched on the last scraggly patch of land before the prairie gave way to the foothills, leaned into the gale like a tired old man. Inside, the world was reduced to the scent of pine smoke, weak stew, and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of her 5-year-old son, Samuel, who slept soundly in their shared bed, oblivious to the world's harsh judgment. Clara was a ghost in the town of Redemption. She had arrived 3 years prior on a dusty stagecoach, her belly swollen with a life she refused to explain, and her eyes holding a story she never told. Redemption, a town built on hard truths and harder scripture, did not suffer mysteries well. They labeled her a widow, though no one had ever seen her husband, and the title was spoken with a curl of the lip. Her origins were unclear, a polite term for what the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, called a past shrouded in sin. Life was a daily battle fought on unforgiving ground. The winter of 1873 had descended with a particular fury, blanketing the barren earth in a sheet of ice that promised no spring. Each morning, Clara would pull her threadbare shawl tighter, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and face the day's ledger of survival. There was wood to be chopped from the meager stand of trees behind her cabin, a task that left her hands raw and splintered. There was water to be hauled from the half-frozen creek, a perilous journey on the slick, icy path. Food was a constant worry, a handful of potatoes, a bit of dried jerky, a small bag of flour. These were treasures to be stretched, rationed, and prayed over. But the physical hardship was a dull ache compared to the sharp sting of the town's contempt. When she ventured into Redemption for supplies, a chill followed her that had nothing to do with the weather. Women would tug their children closer, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. Men would either stare through her as if she were made of glass, or look at her with a raw, assessing hunger that made her skin crawl. In the general store, Mr. Henderson would serve her last, his movements slow and deliberate, making her wait while he chatted amiably with the other customers. She was an outcast, a living embodiment of the unknown, and in a place where survival depended on community. Her isolation was a sentence of slow death, and yet she endured. For Samuel, he was her son, the single point of warmth in her frozen world. He had his father's eyes, a deep, thoughtful brown that sometimes made her heart ache with a fierce, forbidden love. His father, Elias. The name was a secret she held tight in her chest, a burning ember she couldn't let die. Elias was a cowboy, a man as wild and untamed as the land he rode. He wasn't a hero, not in the way the dime novels portrayed them. He was quiet, his face weathered by sun and sorrow, and he carried a sadness in his eyes that Clara had recognized as a mirror of her own. Their story had begun 5 years ago, in the dead of a night much like this one. She had found him bleeding in her barn, half-conscious from a fever and a nasty gash on his side. The result, he'd later mumbled, of a skirmish with a band of Cheyenne warriors who didn't take kindly to cowboys crossing their sacred lands. The town would have let him die or handed him over to the sheriff, who had no love for rootless drifters. But Clara, new to the area and desperate for a human connection that wasn't laced with suspicion, had dragged him inside. For a week, she had nursed him in secret. She cleaned his wound with whiskey and rags, boiled herbs for his fever, and fed him broth from her own meager rations. He was delirious most of the time, murmuring names and places she didn't know, but in his lucid moments, he would watch her, his gaze intense and grateful. He was the first person in this God-forsaken land who had looked at her without judgment. He saw not a fallen woman, but a caregiver, a person. In the shared silence of her tiny cabin, with the world shut out, a fragile bond had formed. Then came the night of the first blizzard. The wind howled a mournful song, and the snow fell in a thick, blinding curtain, sealing them in. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Samuel, just a babe then, was asleep. Elias was finally free of his fever, his strength returning. They sat by the fire, not speaking for a long time. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, with the charged energy of two lonely souls who had found a fleeting harbor in a storm. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "You saved my life, Clara," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. She had only shaken her head, unable to find the words. He'd looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the loneliness she carried like a second skin began to melt away under his gaze. The world outside, with its cold and its cruelty, ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of the fire, the howl of the wind, and the undeniable pull between them. It was a hunger born not just of the flesh, but of a profound, desperate need to be held, to be seen, to not be alone for just one night. That night, they had come together in a quiet, desperate collision of warmth and need. It was a moment of pure, unadorned emotion, a raw and honest connection that felt more real than anything Clara had ever known. In the circle of his arms, she felt safe. She felt wanted. For a few precious hours, she was not the town pariah or a struggling widow. She was just Clara, a woman being held by a man who saw her. When she woke in the gray light of dawn, he was gone. There was no note, no word of farewell, just an empty space beside her in the bed and the lingering scent of leather and pine. The blizzard had broken, and he had ridden out with the first light, disappearing back into the vast, indifferent wilderness from which he had come. The emptiness he left behind was a physical pain, a hollow ache that settled deep in her bones and had never truly left. Months later, her belly began to swell, and the whispers in town turned into certainties. Clara never confirmed their suspicions, never spoke his name. She built a wall of silence around herself and her son, protecting the memory of that one night as both a precious treasure and a terrible burden. The news of his marriage had reached her a year ago, carried on the wind like a cruel piece of gossip. Elias had married June Rutherford, the only daughter of the wealthiest rancher in the county. June was everything Clara was not: respectable, wealthy, with a lineage as solid and unshakable as the mountains themselves. Clara had heard the news while buying thread at the general store. The words had struck her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She had dropped her basket, the spools of thread scattering across the dusty floorboards like fallen dreams. That night, she had wept silently into her pillow, a storm of grief for a future that had never been hers to claim. After that, she had buried him deep in her heart, vowing to never think of him again. But the West was a land that never let you forget. 2 weeks ago, a new rumor had swept through Redemption. Elias, they said, was missing. He had tried to drive a small herd of cattle over the treacherous snow-covered passes of the Wolf's Tooth Mountains. A fool's errand in the heart of winter. A blizzard, even more vicious than the one that had once sealed them together, had descended without warning. His horse had returned to the Rutherford ranch a few days later, half frozen and alone. Search parties had gone out, but they found nothing. The snow was too deep, the wind too relentless. The consensus was grim. Elias was dead, his body lost to the unforgiving mountains, a feast for wolves. Clara had received the news with a strange numbness. It was the death of a ghost, the final closing of a door she had long tried to seal shut. There would be no more chance encounters, no more imagined conversations, no more foolish, secret hope that he might one day ride back and explain why he had left. There was only the cold, hard finality of his absence. Yesterday, driven by an impulse she couldn't explain, she had walked the perimeter of the woods that bordered her property, the same woods that led towards the base of the mountains, and there, caught on the jagged branch of a dead pine, was a piece of him. It was his old sheepskin-lined jacket, worn, frayed at the cuffs, and stained with dirt and time. She recognized it instantly. It was the jacket he'd been wearing the night she found him. He must have shed it on one of his rides, perhaps months ago, and forgotten it. With trembling hands, she had pulled it from the branch. It was stiff with cold, but as she clutched it to her chest, she imagined she could still feel the faint warmth of his body. She could smell it, the familiar, intoxicating scent of horse, worn leather, and the unique, musky scent that was Elias himself. She had smuggled it back to her cabin like a thief, hiding it away in her small wooden chest. Now, with Samuel asleep and the world outside silenced by a fresh layer of snow, she finally allowed herself to grieve. She took the jacket from the chest. The weight of it in her arms was both a comfort and an agony. It was all she had left of him, a tangible piece of a memory. She buried her face in the rough collar, inhaling deeply. The scent was still there, faint but unmistakable. A wave of grief, so powerful it buckled her knees, washed over her. She sank to the floor, wrapping the heavy jacket around her shoulders, pulling it tight as if it were his arms. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed for years streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. Here, in the lonely solitude of her cabin, she held the ghost of the only man who had ever shown her kindness, and she mourned the life they never had. The past, the present, the pain, and the love all swirled together in a suffocating vortex of sorrow. She was so lost in her grief, so completely submerged in the memory of his phantom embrace, that she didn't hear the crunch of boots in the snow outside. She didn't hear the soft creak of her cabin door being pushed open. A sudden draft of icy air cut through her haze of sorrow. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, blocking the pale winter light. The woman was tall and slender, wrapped in a fine wool coat that spoke of wealth and status. Her face, framed by a fur-lined hood, was pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a mixture of desperation and disbelief. It was June, Elias's wife. Her gaze swept the small, impoverished room, taking in the meager furniture, the sleeping child, and finally, landing on Clara. Her eyes narrowed, freezing on the worn leather jacket clutched in Clara's arms, wrapped around her like a lover's embrace. A sharp, audible intake of breath cut the silence. The color drained from June's face, replaced by a mask of stunned, icy shock. The two women stared at each other across the cold, silent room, the wife and the other woman, the past and the present, bound together by a man who was now nothing but a ghost. And in that frozen moment, Clara knew that the past she had tried so desperately to bury had just been unearthed. The silence in the cabin was a brittle thing, stretched taut between the two women. It was June who broke it, her voice as sharp and cold as the air she'd let in. "They say you know things," she began, taking a deliberate step inside and letting the door swing shut with a soft thud. The sound echoed the closing of a cell. "They say in town that before me, there was you, that my husband had a reason to ride past this hovel on the edge of nowhere." Clara remained on the floor, the rough sheepskin of the jacket a shield against her chest. She could feel the rapid, panicked beat of her own heart against the worn leather. She slowly, deliberately, rose to her feet, a quiet act of defiance. She would not be interrogated on her knees. Her gaze met June's across the cramped space, and she saw not just the righteous anger of a wronged wife, but something deeper, a raw, gnawing fear. June was a woman adrift, and she had come here seeking not just a husband, but an anchor, a truth to hold on to in the storm of his disappearance. "The town says many things," Clara replied, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "Most of it is dust on the wind." "Is it?" June's eyes, a pale, wintry blue, narrowed. They flickered from Clara's face to the sleeping form of Samuel in the bed, a flicker so brief it was almost imperceptible. but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. They say he is alive, that he has run off. Some say he is with you, hiding. Where is he, Clara? The name was an indictment, a word she had no right to speak. The directness of the question was a blow. Clara felt the urge to lie, to deny everything, to scream at this woman, to leave her to her grief. But the truth was a complicated, tangled thing. To deny her connection to Elias would be to deny the only moment of genuine warmth she had known in this land. To admit it would be to invite a ruin upon herself and her son that she could not possibly withstand. "If I knew where he was, I wouldn't be here," Clara said, the words carefully chosen. She gestured vaguely at the impoverished cabin, the patched walls, the meager fire. "And you would not have had to come looking." She held June's gaze. "He has vanished. From everyone." The words hung in the air, a truth that applied to them both. For a moment, a flicker of shared loss passed between them, but it was quickly extinguished by June's suspicion. June's pristine life had been upended, her future erased. She needed a villain, a reason, and the woman standing before her, clutching her husband's jacket, was the most obvious candidate. As June stared, her face a mask of cold fury, Clara felt the present recede. The sight of this woman, the wife, sent her spiraling back into the memory she guarded so fiercely, the one night that was hers and hers alone. The rain had been relentless, turning the world outside her window into a churning sea of mud and darkness. It was a night for ghosts, and one had stumbled into her barn. Not a ghost, but a man close to being one. Elias. He had been running. He'd gasped. From a posse hired by a cattle baron he'd crossed in a card game gone wrong. But his flight had been cut short by a fall from his horse, reopening a wound in his side that was already festering from some older, deeper trouble. He was burning with fever, his words a jumbled mess, his strength gone. She'd half carried, half dragged him inside, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. Harboring a fugitive was a hanging offense, but leaving him to die felt like a greater sin. For days, he was a whisper away from death. She'd cleaned the angry, inflamed gash with the last of her whiskey, tearing her own underskirt for clean bandages. She'd sat by his side, pressing cool, damp cloths to his forehead, forcing sips of willow bark tea and thin porridge between his cracked lips. She'd listened to him murmur in his delirium of vast, empty plains, of a brother named Jacob lost to the war, of a promise he couldn't keep. She learned the map of his face in the flickering lamplight, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the deep lines etched around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw even in unconsciousness. She mended the tear in his worn cotton shirt, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar fabric, the needle a tiny, rhythmic anchor in the long, silent nights. She was tending not just to a body, but to a life, a story. In his absolute vulnerability, he was no longer a stranger, but a responsibility, a secret, a presence that filled the crushing emptiness of her existence. Then the blizzard came, burying the rain under a suffocating blanket of white. The world shrank to the four walls of her cabin. The wind shrieked, but inside, a fragile peace had settled. His fever broke. He woke one afternoon, his eyes clear for the first time, and looked at her. He truly saw her. "You're still here," he'd whispered, his voice raspy. "Nowhere else to go," she had answered with a small, sad smile. That night, the storm raged its hardest. The cabin groaned under the weight of the snow and wind. They sat by the fire, the sleeping form of her infant son a small mound under a pile of blankets. Elias spoke of his life, of riding the open range, of the fleeting freedom and the profound loneliness of it all. He spoke of feeling like a man out of time, a relic in a world that was being fenced in and tamed. Clara listened, and for the first time, she spoke too. She told him not of her past, but of her present, of the cold shoulders in town, of the struggle to feed herself and her child, of the fear that gnawed at her in the darkest hours of the night. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He simply listened, his dark eyes holding hers, his presence a silent acknowledgement of her struggle. The air between them grew thick with a current of understanding, a recognition of the shared scars they carried, his on his body, hers on her soul. He reached across the small space that separated them, his hand covering hers where it rested on the rough wooden floor. His touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that spread through her entire body. It wasn't a gesture of ownership or desire, but one of simple, profound connection. A lifetime of loneliness seemed to well up inside her, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. He gently wiped it away with his thumb. In that moment, the roles of patient and caregiver dissolved. They were just a man and a woman, trapped and isolated from the world, finding a desperate solace in one another. When he leaned in and kissed her, it felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability, like two rivers converging after a long journey apart. It was a kiss of shared sorrow, of fierce survival, of a deep, aching need to feel alive. Their coming together was not a wild, reckless passion. It was quiet, intense, and deeply emotional. It was an act of silent communion, a desperate affirmation of life against the howling death of the storm outside. In his arms, she was not an outcast. She was not a mystery. She was Clara, and she was cherished. It was a feeling so foreign and so powerful that it frightened her. The morning brought a world of blinding white and deafening silence. The blizzard had passed. She awoke slowly, a smile on her lips, a feeling of peace settling in her bones for the first time in memory. But the space beside her was cold. The imprint of his body was still on the mattress. But he was gone. He had taken his mended shirt, his guns, and his horse, and vanished into the newly silent world as quietly as he had arrived. There was no note, no goodbye, just a profound and echoing emptiness that was far worse than the loneliness that had come before. He had shown her what it was to feel whole, only to leave her more broken than ever. "And this jacket." June's voice, sharp and laced with a horrifying new tone of discovery, ripped Clara from her memory. She blinked, the fire-lit past dissolving into the cold, gray present. June had taken a step closer, her eyes fixed on the sheepskin collar Clara's hands were still clutching. "Where did you get that?" June demanded, her voice trembling with a dawning, terrible realization. Clara said nothing, her throat tight. What could she say? "It was left for me by the ghost of a man we both loved?" June's face was a canvas of disbelief and pain. Her gaze was locked on the dark leather, a frantic, desperate recognition in her eyes. She looked as if she were seeing a specter. "That jacket," June whispered, the words barely audible. Her hand went to her mouth, her knuckles white. "He wore that on our wedding day." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical slap. The wedding day, the jacket she held, this sacred relic of her night, of her secret, was also a part of his public life with this other woman. The man she had saved, the man who had shared her bed, had worn this very garment to pledge his life to another. The memory, once a source of painful comfort, was now tainted, desecrated. The warmth she had imagined clinging to the fabric felt like a liar's heat. All the strength drained from Clara's limbs. The confrontation, the memories, the brutal revelation. It was too much. The weight of it all was crushing. She looked at June's shattered face, at the righteous fury being eclipsed by a deep, soul-crushing hurt she knew all too well. There were no words that could bridge the chasm that had just opened between them. An explanation would be an insult. An apology would be a lie. Silence was the only truth she had left to offer. Without another word, Clara clutched the heavy jacket tighter to her chest, a final, desperate act of possession. Then, she turned her back on Elias's wife, presenting June with nothing but her rigid shoulders and the damning evidence she held in her arms. She stared at the rough, cold logs of her cabin wall, her own reflection staring back from the grimy window pane, the face of a woman who had just lost the same man twice. June did not leave the cabin screaming. She did not threaten or curse. She simply backed away, her face a mask of pale, frozen horror, and vanished into the swirling snow as silently as she had appeared. But her silence was more damning than any accusation. It was the silence of a bomb before it explodes. Within a day, the fallout reached Clara. The rumor, born in the shocked silence of June Rutherford's heart, traveled first to the sprawling Rutherford Ranch, where it was whispered in hushed, horrified tones between maids and ranch hands. From there, it galloped into redemption, passed from the stable boy to the blacksmith, from the blacksmith's wife to the seamstress, and from the seamstress to the venomous tongue of Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, who considered the town's morality her personal garden to weed. Standing on the steps of the church after the sparse Sunday service, Mrs. Gable held court. "An illicit affair," she declared, her voice carrying across the frozen yard. "Under our very noses, that woman on the hill has been harboring a serpent." The story grew with each telling, twisting and fattening like a parasite. "They say she bewitched him," one woman whispered over a fence to her neighbor. "A woman with a past like hers knows certain arts." In the smoky confines of the saloon, the talk was cruder. "Always knew there was something off about her." A farmer grumbled into his beer. "Quiet ones are always the wildest." Then, the inevitable, poisonous seed was planted. "And the boy?" someone asked, a sly, knowing look in his eye. "He's got dark hair, like Elias." The speculation became fact overnight. "That child is Elias Rutherford's bastard." The words were a judgment, a branding iron searing Clara's name. The town, restless and bored through the long winter, had found its drama. And in the center of it, there was a convenient villain and a righteous victim. Poor June, the women clucked, shaking their heads in sympathy. "Her father will see she gets justice. She will reclaim her honor." The town's judgment was not content to remain in the realm of whispers. It soon arrived at Clara's doorstep, hard and ugly. The first sign was a rock, thrown in the dead of night, that struck the cabin wall with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot. Clara leaped from her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, and instinctively threw her body over Samuel, who had stirred with a whimper. She lay there for an hour, listening to the wind and the pounding of her own blood, waiting for the next blow. It came the next morning. When she opened the door to fetch water, she found a pile of rotting vegetable scraps and animal entrails dumped on her stoop. The stench was foul, a clear message of her place in the town's estimation. She was garbage. Her cheeks burned with a humiliation so profound it felt like a physical illness. With Samuel watching from the doorway, his small face etched with confusion, she wordlessly cleaned up the filth, her hands shaking with a rage she could not afford to show. The attacks grew bolder. A window pane was shattered one afternoon, showering the floor with glittering shards of ice-cold glass. Shouts of "harlot" and "witch" would echo from the road at night, fired from the safety of darkness by cowardly men and boys emboldened by righteous gossip. Clara began to feel like a prisoner in her own home, the thin wooden walls her only defense against a tide of hatred. They didn't want the truth. The truth was messy and complicated. They wanted a sinner to punish, a scapegoat to carry the weight of their own bleak, hard-bitten lives. The final blow came not as a rock, but as a piece of paper, delivered by the town's landowner, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose piety was matched only by his avarice. He stood at her door, refusing to meet her eye, his face pinched with discomfort. "Clara," he began, clearing his throat, "it has come to my attention that your circumstances have changed. The town is unsettled." "I pay my rent, Mr. Abernathy, she said, her voice tight. That may be so, he said, finally looking at her, his eyes cold and devoid of sympathy. But your lease agreement was for a widow of good standing. It is a verbal contract, you understand, but one based on certain assumptions of propriety. I'm afraid, given the current unpleasantness, I must consider the contract expired. I'll need you and the boy out by the end of the month. The words hung in the frigid air. Eviction. In the dead of winter, it was a death sentence. She looked at his impassive face and saw the true, cold heart of redemption. It was not a town of second chances. It was a place of unforgiving judgment, where a single misstep could send you plummeting into an abyss. As the days bled into one another, despair began to settle over Clara like a shroud. She rationed their food even more stringently, her own stomach often aching with a hunger she ignored. She spent her nights staring into the dying embers of the fire, trying to devise a plan, a way out, but every path she imagined led to a dead end. It was during this bleak period that a new presence made itself known. His name was Micah, a cowboy who had ridden with Elias years ago. He was a stark contrast to Elias's restless energy. Micah was quiet, broad-shouldered, and moved with a slow, deliberate economy that suggested a deep well of patience. He had Elias's scent of leather and dust, but none of his haunted, far-away look. Micah's eyes were a clear, steady gray, and they saw everything. He didn't announce his intentions. He simply appeared one morning while Clara was trying to patch a hole in her small barn roof, her fingers numb with cold. He took the hammer from her hand without a word and, with a few powerful, efficient swings, drove the nails home. He spent the rest of the day reinforcing the barn's weakened wall, his silence a comfortable, unobtrusive presence. Before he left, he placed a heavy burlap sack on her porch. Inside was a slab of bacon, a bag of flour, and a small tin of coffee. He was gone before she could properly thank him. He came back every few days after that, never staying long, never asking for anything. He would chop a week's worth of firewood, his axe rising and falling in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. He'd check her snares, leaving a rabbit or two hanging by the door. He spoke little, but his actions were a lifeline. He was an old friend of Elias, and perhaps he felt a sense of duty, or perhaps he was simply a man who recognized injustice when he saw it and chose not to look away. His quiet acts of kindness were the only thing keeping Clara and Samuel from starvation. But his help could not solve the turmoil raging inside her. Every night, she looked at Samuel's sleeping face, tracing the line of his jaw, looking into his dark, innocent eyes, and the question tormented her. Should she tell the world the truth? To declare that Samuel was Elias's son might silence some of the crueler whispers. It would give her a claim, a sliver of legitimacy. But what would it do to her son? He would be branded a bastard for the rest of his life, a living symbol of his father's supposed sin and his mother's shame. He would carry the weight of Elias's name and the Rutherford feud. Keeping the secret protected him, kept him hers and hers alone. But it was a secret that was slowly starving them, freezing them, and getting them cast out into the wilderness. The silence she had maintained for 5 years was no longer a shield. It had become a cage. One evening, as a low, mournful wind whipped snow against the newly repaired window pane, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, hesitant, completely unlike the belligerent pounding she had grown used to. Her hand went to the small knife she now kept by the door. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice tense. "It's June." Clara froze. She slowly unlatched the door and pulled it open just a crack. June stood on the porch, snowflakes melting in her blonde hair. The imperious anger from her first visit was gone. In its place was a profound weariness, a deep, hollowed-out confusion that made her look older, more fragile. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice quiet. Clara hesitated, then stepped back, allowing her into the small, warm space. June unwrapped the fine wool scarf from her neck, her movements slow and tired. She did not look at Samuel, who was sitting on the floor, carving a piece of wood with a dull knife Micah had given him. Her eyes were fixed on Clara. "I haven't slept," June began, her voice raw. "Every time I close my eyes, I see you, holding his jacket." She took a breath. "My father wants me to press the matter. He wants to have you run out of the territory on a morals charge. He says I must protect the family name." "And what do you want?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. June sank onto the single wooden chair by the table, her shoulders slumping. "I want to understand," she said, looking up at Clara, her eyes filled not with hate, but with a desperate, pleading bewilderment. "My marriage. It was not what people thought. He was kind, in his way, but he was absent. Even when he was sitting right across from me, it was like living with a ghost. I thought I was the reason. I thought I wasn't enough." A painful silence fell between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the scraping of Samuel's knife on wood. For the first time, Clara saw June not as a rival, but as another woman caught in the tangled web of Elias's secrets. "He promised me a life," June continued, her voice thick with unshed tears. "A legacy, children to carry on the Rutherford name. He spoke of building an empire, but his heart was never in it. It was always somewhere else. Out there." She gestured toward the window, toward the vast, dark expanse of the plains and mountains. Clara thought of the man she had known, the man who spoke of freedom and loneliness, who felt caged by the world. It was a side of him June had likely never seen. "He never spoke of those things to me," Clara said softly. "He spoke of running, of a promise he couldn't keep." June looked at her, a flicker of something new in her eyes, not suspicion, but a dawning, painful curiosity. "What promise?" And so they began to talk, not as enemies, but as two cartographers trying to map the same lost territory, the heart of Elias Rutherford. June spoke of the handsome, respectable rancher's son-in-law he was supposed to be, a man who felt more at home in the saddle than in her parlor. Clara spoke of the wounded, feverish fugitive who craved connection but feared being tied down. They pieced together a portrait of a man torn in two, a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere, a man who had made promises to them both that he was incapable of keeping. The conversation was a slow, painful excavation of their shared past, digging through layers of rumor, pride, and hurt. They were two women who should have been mortal enemies. Yet in their shared grief and disillusionment, they found a strange, fragile common ground. They had both loved a man who was, in the end, an enigma. As the fire burned low, and Samuel finally drifted to sleep on his pallet, a sense of clarity settled over Clara. This woman was not her enemy. The town was her enemy. The hunger was her enemy. The cold was her enemy. June was just another victim, and perhaps the only way to survive was to offer a piece of the truth she had guarded for so long. "There's something else," Clara said, her voice low and serious. June leaned forward, her face pale in the dim light. "The last time I saw him, that morning he left, he knew he was leaving for good." "What did he say?" June breathed. Clara looked into the eyes of her rival, the woman who held the name she could never claim, and made a choice. "He told me that if he ever disappeared," Clara said, the words coming out in a slow, deliberate torrent, "I shouldn't believe he was dead. He said he was going to atone for a mistake, and that some mistakes cost a man everything." Elias's words about atonement, about vanishing to pay for a mistake, hung in the air of Clara's cabin long after June had departed into the night. It was a strange and unsettling kind of hope, or perhaps a different kind of dread. The idea that Elias was not a victim of the mountains, but a fugitive from his own life, was a seed that took root in the barren soil of Clara's heart. For 2 weeks, the town held its breath. The search parties were called off. The snow fell, covering any tracks, any evidence, any hope. Elias Rutherford was officially a ghost, a story to be told by the fire. Then the spring thaw came, reluctantly at first, then in a rush of muddy, churning water. The ice on the Redemption River cracked and groaned, and the river swelled, disgorging the secrets the winter had kept. It was two trappers checking their lines downriver who found him, or what was left of him. The body was snagged on a tangle of tree roots at the river's edge, the clothes in tatters, the flesh ravaged by the relentless work of scavengers and the river itself. It was an ugly, anonymous ruin of a man, something the wilderness had claimed and partially digested. But there were two things the wolves and the water had not taken. On the bloated skeletal finger of one hand was a simple, heavy gold band, the wedding ring a man like Jedediah Rutherford would insist his son-in-law wear, and tucked into the rotting leather of his gun belt, preserved by some miracle in its holster, was a Colt Peacemaker. On the silver inlay of its handle, tarnished but still legible, was the engraved name Elias. The trappers brought the body back to town slung over a pack mule. There was no dignity in it. The news spread not like wildfire, but like a slow, cold fog. The ghost had been given a corpse. The mystery had found its grim, unceremonious conclusion. Clara heard the news from Micah, who came to her door at dusk, his face grim, his hat in his hands. "They found him, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble, "down by the river." Clara felt the world tilt. The strange seed of hope withered and died in an instant, replaced by a cold, hollow certainty. The man she had saved, the man she had loved, the man who had left her, was truly gone. There would be no atonement, no return. There was only this brutal, ragged end. She simply nodded, unable to speak, and closed the door, leaning her forehead against the rough wood, the finality of it all a crushing weight. The funeral was a hurried, pathetic affair. Jedediah Rutherford wanted it over with, a final piece of unpleasant business to be dispensed with before his daughter's life could be scrubbed clean and restarted. He asked Preacher Thompson to say a few words over the plain pine box, but the preacher, his face a mask of pious disapproval and his ears still ringing with his wife's moral pronouncements, refused. "I cannot, in good conscience, read the Lord's scripture for a man of such duplicity," he'd announced, his voice carrying from the church steps. "A man who broke his sacred vows and brought shame upon this community. His soul must be left to God's own judgment." So, Elias was buried without a prayer. A handful of Rutherford's ranch hands lowered the coffin into the frozen earth of the town cemetery, their faces stony and impassive. June stood beside her father, a veiled figure in black, looking small and brittle against the vast, gray sky. She didn't weep. Her face was a blank canvas of bitterness and exhaustion. She looked like a woman who was burying not a husband, but a long and painful chapter of her life. When the first shovelful of dirt hit the coffin lid with a hollow thud, she flinched, then turned and walked back toward her father's carriage without a backward glance. Clara watched from the hill above the town, hidden in a stand of bare-limbed aspens. She was a ghost at her own lover's funeral. She saw the small, sad procession, the lack of mourners, the indecent haste of it all. This was the town's final judgment on Elias Rutherford. He had lived between two worlds, and in the end, he belonged to neither. Within a week, June had moved out of the large, empty house she had shared with Elias and returned to her parents' ranch. The curtains were drawn, the gate was locked, and a silence fell over the place. June Rutherford had retreated from the world, taking her shame and her broken heart with her into the gilded cage of her father's protection. For Clara, there was no retreat. Her world, already shrinking, now began to collapse in on her. The eviction notice from Mr. Abernathy was a ticking clock, the whispers in town, though quieter now that the central drama was over, had settled into a kind of permanent, low-grade contempt. She was no longer a scandalous mystery. She was just a soiled woman, a piece of leftover wreckage from the storm. Then the winds came, not the biting gales of winter, but the dry, relentless winds of early spring that scoured the plains, picking up dust and grit and hurling it against the world. For 2 days and 2 nights, the wind howled, a ceaseless, malevolent force that clawed at Clara's small cabin. It found every crack, every weakness. On the second night, with a sound like a great beast tearing something apart, a section of the roof over the main room was ripped away. Icy rain and sleet poured in, drenching their meager belongings. Clara scrambled to move their bed, their food, everything of value, into the tiny, dry corner of the bedroom. She and Samuel huddled together under every blanket they owned, listening to the storm rage inside their own home. The wind was a voice, and it seemed to be screaming at her. "You are alone. You are not safe. You will be destroyed." The storm passed, leaving behind a scene of devastation. A gaping hole stared up at the unforgiving gray sky. A pool of muddy water covered the floor. The cabin, her only sanctuary, was broken. And then Samuel started coughing. At first, it was just a small, dry cough. Clara gave him tea and kept him warm, telling herself it was just a chill from the dampness. But the cough deepened, becoming a rattling, chest-splitting sound that terrified her. By evening, the fever had set in. His skin was fire, but he shivered violently. His teeth chattering, he became delirious, muttering nonsense. His eyes wide and glassy, but seeing nothing. Clara recognized the sickness. It was the same lung fever, what some called malaria of the swamps, that had taken her own mother years ago. It moved fast, and it was merciless. The town doctor was a drunkard who wouldn't have come to her cabin anyway, and she had no money for him even if he would. She tried every remedy she knew: cool cloths, willow bark tea, fervent, desperate prayers whispered into his hot forehead. Nothing worked. The fever climbed, and his breathing grew shallow and labored, each breath a painful, wet rasp. She sat with him through the night, a cold, hard knot of terror tightening in her gut. She watched the life draining out of her son, the one beautiful, perfect thing in her world, and she felt a despair so absolute it was like drowning. This was her punishment. For her secrets, for her one night of happiness, for loving a man she shouldn't have loved. The world was taking everything from her. Just before dawn, when Samuel's breathing was so faint she had to press her ear to his lips to feel it, she knew she had no choice left. She was watching him die. In a frenzy of desperation, she wrapped him in their thickest wool blanket, pulled on her own worn coat, and burst out of the cabin, intending to run into town, to scream, to beg, to trade her own life for his. She ran right into the solid form of Micah, who was standing on her porch, his hand raised as if to knock. He had a sack of supplies slung over his shoulder. He took one look at her wild, tear-streaked face, at the small, limp bundle in her arms, and his own face hardened with a grim understanding. "The fever?" he asked, his voice rough. She could only nod, a sob catching in her throat. He's not breathing right. Micah, he's dying." Micah didn't hesitate. He gently but firmly took Samuel from her arms. "The nearest real doctor is at the trading post at Fort Bridger," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in her sea of panic. "It's 30 miles. I can make it by morning if I ride hard." 30 miles, through the muddy, half-frozen wilderness. It was an impossible journey. "Take my horse," he commanded, gesturing to the sturdy gelding tied to a nearby tree. "He's faster. Keep the supplies. I'll take the boy." Before she could protest, before she could even process it, he was moving. He cradled Samuel against his broad chest, using his own body as a shield against the wind. He strode over to his horse, mounted in one smooth, powerful motion, and settled her son securely in front of him. He looked back at her one last time, his gray eyes meeting hers in the pale, pre-dawn light. "Keep a fire going, Clara," he said, and then he spurred the horse, and they were gone, melting into the dark. tangled woods. Clara stood on the porch, frozen, watching the empty space where they had been. She had just placed the entire contents of her world into the hands of a man she barely knew and sent him off into the night. The silence that descended was absolute, terrifying. She did as he said. She went inside, rebuilt the fire, and began to wait. The hours that followed were the longest of her life. She paced the small, dry corner of the cabin. She cleaned the mess from the storm. She prayed until her throat was raw. Every gust of wind sounded like a horse's return. Every shadow seemed to be the shape of a man carrying a child. She was suspended in a purgatory of hope and fear. Late the next afternoon, she saw him. He was walking, leading his exhausted horse, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. But in his arms, he carried Samuel, and Samuel was stirring. She ran to meet them, her heart in her throat. Micah looked utterly spent. His face caked with mud and stubble, but he managed a small, tired smile. The doctor gave him quinine and lanced his chest to let the fluid out, he said, his voice raspy. He says the fever broke a few hours ago. He's going to be all right. Clara. He gently handed Samuel back to her. The boy was pale and weak, but his eyes were clear, and his breathing, though shallow, was even. He was warm, but it was the natural warmth of life, not the raging fire of the fever. Clara clutched him to her chest, burying her face in his hair, a wave of relief so powerful it left her weak-kneed. That night, with Samuel sleeping soundly and peacefully for the first time in days, and with Micah asleep from sheer exhaustion on a pallet by the fire, Clara sat alone in the quiet dark. The terror had receded, leaving behind a vast, hollowed-out emptiness. She was scraped raw, emotionally and spiritually. She had been brought to the very edge of the abyss and back. And in that profound quiet, a memory surfaced, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. It was Elias's voice, not from their night together, but from the fevered, rambling whispers when she had first tended to him. He had been looking at her, his eyes lucid for just a moment, filled with a deep, haunting sadness. "I'm no good, Clara," he had whispered, his voice hoarse with fever and regret. "I bring ruin. I don't deserve you. I don't deserve anyone. You should move on and forget you ever saw me." She had dismissed it then as the ramblings of a sick man. But now, in the wake of his death, in the wake of her son's near death, she heard the truth in those words. It was not a plea for her to save him. It was a warning. He knew the darkness he carried. He knew the chaos that followed him. He had tried to tell her who he was. The wall she had built around her heart for 5 long years, the wall of stoicism and silent endurance, finally crumbled. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips, then another and another. Soon, she was weeping. Not the silent, dignified tears of a grieving woman, but the gut-wrenching, ugly, howling sobs of a soul that had finally broken. She cried for Elias, for the ghost she had loved and lost. She cried for her son, for the life she had almost lost. But most of all, she cried for herself, for the lonely, frightened woman who had endured everything in silence, and who had finally been pushed past the point of endurance. She sank to the floor, her body shaking, and for the first time since she had arrived in this hard, unforgiving land, Clara Martin wept. Clara's great, shuddering grief broke that night and, like a spring flood, receded to leave a landscape that was scoured clean, desolate, but strangely peaceful. The terror had passed. Samuel, though still pale and thin, was alive. His laughter, weak at first, then stronger each day, was a sound that began to fill the hollow spaces in the cabin and in Clara's heart. The hole in the roof was patched, thanks to Micah, whose presence had become a quiet, steady rhythm in their lives. He never spoke of the 30-mile ride that had saved her son's life, but it lay between them, an unspoken debt of a magnitude Clara could never repay. He was a constant, solid presence in a world that had offered her nothing but shifting sands. But while a fragile peace settled within the walls of her cabin, the town of Redemption had not finished with its judgment. With Elias buried and June secluded on her father's ranch, the town's vitriol needed a new focus. They found it in Clara. The story of her connection to Elias was now common lore, and they gave her a new title, one spoken with a sneer in the general store and a self-righteous sniff at the church. They called her Elias's self-proclaimed widow. The name was a particular cruelty, designed to mock her grief and deny any legitimacy to her past. It implied she was a scheming opportunist, a woman laying claim to a man and a life that were never hers. The women of the town, led by Mrs. Gable, treated her with a theatrical, pitying contempt that was far worse than their previous open hostility. Micah bore the brunt of their disapproval alongside her, because he continued to bring her supplies and help with repairs. He was seen as her co-conspirator, a man consorting with a fallen woman. One afternoon, he was stopped on the main street by Sheriff Miller, a man who served Jedediah Rutherford's interests far more than the town's. Micah recounted the conversation to Clara later that evening, his voice low and even, but with a hard edge of anger in his gray eyes. "Miller told me my association with you was unseemly and a disruption to the community. Said if I knew what was good for me, I'd stay clear of this hill." "He was warning you on behalf of the Rutherfords," Clara said, her heart sinking. She looked at this good, quiet man who was putting himself in jeopardy for her. "Micah, you don't have to do this. You've done more than enough. I can't have you bringing their wrath down on yourself." "Clara," he said, and it was one of the few times he'd used her name so directly. He met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "I'm not a man who can be told who to help or who to speak to. Elias was my friend, but he made his own choices. And what this town is doing to you, it ain't right. I'm not walking away." His loyalty was a balm, but it was also a burden, another weight of worry for her to carry. She was an anchor, pulling a good man down with her into the depths. A few days later, just as dusk was painting the prairie in shades of bruised purple and orange, another visitor arrived. Clara's hand immediately went to the door latch, her body tensing. But when she saw the figure on the porch, her fear was replaced by a weary surprise. It was June. She looked different from her previous visits. The anger was gone, as was the lost, bewildered look. She seemed settled, calm, but it was the calmness of a deep, still body of water. And Clara knew that unimaginable things could lie in those depths. She was dressed simply, in a dark riding skirt and a plain blouse, her fine wool coats and veiled hats left behind. She looked less like the rancher's daughter and more like an ordinary woman. "I won't stay long," June said, her voice even. There is one last thing I need to know." Clara stepped aside and let her in. The two women stood in the small cabin, the air thick with the ghosts of their past encounters. Samuel was asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady, healthy rhythm. June's eyes fell on the old sheepskin jacket, which Clara had folded and placed on a high shelf, unable to bring herself to get rid of it entirely. "It always came back to you," June said, her voice soft and devoid of accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "Even at the end, I found his will. He wrote it the day before he rode into the mountains. He left me the house and a portion of the livestock, enough to be proper, but he left $1,000, a fortune, to be given to C.M. in redemption. Should he not return, my father tore the document to pieces. He said it was the ravings of a madman." Clara felt a cold shock. $1,000. Enough to escape, to start over, to give Samuel a life free from shame. Elias had tried to provide for her, even as he was walking away, and Jedediah Rutherford had denied her even that. "I don't want the money," June said quickly, seeing the look on Clara's face. "That's not why I'm here. Knowing he did that, it just makes my question more urgent." She turned to face Clara fully, her blue eyes clear and piercing. I have made my peace with the fact that my marriage was a lie. I have made my peace with the fact that he is gone, but I will have no rest until I know the truth of this one thing." She took a breath. "I need to know, Clara, from you, in his heart, who did Elias truly love?" The question was the bluntest instrument, aimed directly at the heart of everything. Clara's mind raced. What could she say? To say me would be an act of supreme arrogance and cruelty. To say you would be a lie. To say both would be a meaningless platitude. Words were insufficient. They were traps. Instead of answering, she looked up at the jacket on the shelf. An idea, a final, desperate gamble, formed in her mind. "There is only one person who can answer that," she said quietly. She reached up and carefully took the heavy jacket down from the shelf. The leather was cold, the sheepskin lining soft against her hands. For a moment, she held it, this last, tangible piece of him, this source of so much pain and revelation. Her intention was to simply give the jacket to June, a final concession. But as her fingers brushed against the inside pocket, she felt something she had never noticed before. A crisp, folded piece of paper tucked deep inside the lining. Her heart stopped. All this time, through all the grief and turmoil, a message had been waiting. Her first instinct was a fierce, possessive urge to keep it, to read it herself, to finally know. Her hand trembled. This letter could hold the answer to every question that had haunted her for 5 years. But then she looked at June's face, at the raw, desperate need for truth in her eyes. June had lost a husband, a future, a name. All Clara had ever really had of him was a secret, and maybe this last secret was not hers to keep. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like letting go of the last 5 years of her life, she held out the folded, worn piece of paper to June. "He left this in his pocket," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never knew it was there. I've never read it." June looked from the letter to Clara's face, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. She saw the truth of Clara's words, the magnitude of the sacrifice she was making. Slowly, she reached out and took the letter, her fingers brushing against Clara's. The paper was cool to the touch. With trembling hands, June unfolded it. The cabin was utterly silent save for the soft crackle of the fire. She began to read, her eyes moving across the page, her expression unreadable. Clara watched her, her own heart pounding, feeling as if her entire life was being weighed and judged by the words on that page. She saw a flicker of pain in June's eyes, then a flash of understanding, and finally, a deep, profound sadness that seemed to settle over her like a winter cloak. After what felt like an eternity, June looked up, her face pale. She held the letter loosely in her hand. "It's addressed to you," she said, her voice flat. She cleared her throat and, in a low, steady monotone, as if reading a death sentence, she read the words aloud. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means I did not have the courage to say it to your face, and I have gone to a place where I can no longer cause you harm. There are 2 paths a man can walk in this life. The one he is told is right, and the one his soul knows is true. I have spent my life caught between them, and in doing so, have failed everyone, most of all myself. June is a good woman. She is the dream of a life I was supposed to want, a life of legacy, of land, of honor. I tried to love her. I think, in a way, I do. I love the order she represents, the goodness, but it is the love a man has for a beautiful, distant star, something to be admired, but never reached, never held. But you, Clara, you are not a star. You are the earth. You are the fire. With you, for one night, I was not a Rutherford or a rancher or a disappointment. I was just a man, a whole man. The life I saw in your eyes was not one of legacy, but one of truth. A small cabin, a warm fire, a life lived honestly. It is the only thing I have ever truly wanted, and the one thing my own cowardice and obligations would never let me claim. I am going to try and undo a great wrong I have committed, a wrong that has nothing to do with you or June. It is a debt of blood that must be paid. I do not expect to return. Do not mourn the man I was. Clara, mourn the man I could have been had I been stronger, the man who would have stayed. Yours, in another life, Elias. The last word hung in the air, an echo of a promise from a ghost. June slowly refolded the letter, her movement stiff and precise. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. A strange, bitter smile touched her lips. Huh. She let out a short, sharp breath that was almost a laugh. Well, there it is. She looked at Clara, her eyes filled with a terrible, lucid clarity. I should have seen this letter before I married him. It would have saved us all a great deal of pain. The confession, the raw, undeniable truth of it, left Clara feeling empty. There was no victory, no vindication, just a shared, profound ache. June, she said softly, if you still want your honor, if it would bring you peace, I will go. Samuel and I will be gone by morning. No one will ever have to know. June looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, Clara felt as if she was seeing her not as a rival or a sinner, but as another human being. June shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. The bitter smile faded, replaced by a look of weary resolve. I don't need honor anymore, she said, her voice clear and strong. I have spent my whole life chasing it, protecting it. It's a cage made of other people's opinions. She held up the letter. This is real. The pain is real. What he felt for you was real. She paused, taking a deep breath, and it seemed to Clara that she was letting go of a lifetime of expectations. I don't need honor, June repeated, her voice ringing with a newfound conviction. I just need the truth. The truth, once spoken, did not bring peace. It brought a reckoning. June's departure from Clara's cabin, with Elias's letter clutched in her hand, sent a new and dangerous tremor through the town. Her father, Jedediah Rutherford, a man accustomed to controlling every narrative in redemption, could not allow this new truth to stand. He could not abide the idea of his daughter sympathizing with the woman who had, in his eyes, dishonored his family. Elias was dead and couldn't be punished, but Clara Martin was very much alive, and she would be made to pay. He orchestrated it all from the shadows, using the town's self-appointed moral guardians as his puppets. A week after June's last visit, a notice was posted on the door of the general store in the church. A community hearing was to be held in the town hall concerning matters of public decency and the continued residence of one Clara Martin. It was not a legal proceeding. It was something far older and more dangerous. A tribunal of public opinion. A kangaroo court designed not to find facts, but to formally pass a sentence that had already been decided. The goal was simple: to create a public justification for running Clara and her son out of town for good. On the appointed evening, the town hall was packed. It was a cold, clear night, and the room was stuffy with the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and self-righteousness. Nearly everyone was there, their faces a mixture of grim curiosity and cruel anticipation. They had come to see a sinner cast out. At the front of the room, on a makeshift dais, sat the architects of this inquisition, Mr. Abernathy, the landowner, his face pinched and officious, and Preacher Thompson, who looked upon the assembly with the grave air of a man doing God's unpleasant but necessary work. Jedediah Rutherford was conspicuously absent, preferring to let his surrogates do the dirty work. When Clara entered, the room fell into a hostile silence. She had walked from her cabin through the cold, her head held high, her hand gripping Samuel's tightly. But it was the man who walked at her other side that caused a wave of murmurs to ripple through the crowd. Micah stood tall and solid beside her, his face set like stone, his steady gray eyes sweeping over the assembly with a look of quiet profound contempt. He was making his stand, and everyone in the room understood the significance of it. Preacher Thompson began the proceedings, his voice oozing a false piety. "We are gathered here this evening not to cast stones," he lied, "but to preserve the moral fabric of our community, a community which has been grievously wounded by scandal and impropriety." Mr. Abernathy then took over, all business and feigned regret. "It has been determined," he announced, as if reading from a ledger, "that the presence of Clara Martin, a woman of unclear origins and questionable associations, poses a threat to the peace and good order of redemption. Her actions have brought shame upon the memory of a respected, albeit troubled, man, and have caused untold suffering to his blameless widow." They spoke of her as if she weren't there. Clara stood silently, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had expected this, but the reality of it, the sight of all these faces, people she had passed on the street, people who had watched her struggle in silence, now united in their condemnation, was suffocating. "Do you have anything to say in your defense, woman?" Preacher Thompson asked, his tone making it clear that no defense was possible. Clara looked out at the sea of hard, judgmental faces. Words felt useless. What could she say that they would possibly believe? Before she could speak, Micah stepped forward. "I have something to say," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room. "I've been listening to you talk about moral fabric and community. But what I see here isn't a community. It's a pack of wolves that's found a wounded animal and decided to tear it apart." A gasp went through the crowd. "This is a woman who has lost the man she loved," Micah continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "A mother who nearly lost her child. She has harmed none of you. She has asked for nothing from you. Her only crime is that her life is a mirror to the secrets you all keep buried. You're not casting her out because she's a sinner. You're casting her out because she reminds you of your own sins." "That's enough, Mr. Abernathy shouted, his face turning beet red. "You are out of order, sir. You are an outsider here yourself." "I'm a man who knows right from wrong," Micah shot back, "which seems to be more than I can say for most folks in this room. Consider your line of credit at my store officially revoked, Micah." Abernathy snapped, using the only weapon he had. "You'll buy no more supplies in this town." The threat hung in the air. In this part of the world, being cut off from the general store was a slow death sentence. Micah didn't flinch. He simply looked at Abernathy with disgust and stepped back to stand beside Clara. His point made, his allegiance declared. It seemed that the verdict was sealed. The crowd was muttering, their anger stoked by Micah's defiance. Preacher Thompson raised his hands, ready to deliver the final judgment. "Wait." The voice was quiet, nervous, and came from the back of the room. Heads turned. A man was pushing his way forward, his hat clutched in his hands. He was Orville Potts, the mail carrier, a man so quiet and unassuming that most people barely noticed him. I have something to say," Orville stammered, his face pale under the lantern light. He looked terrified, but determined. He came to a stop before the dais, avoiding the furious glares of Abernathy and the preacher. "I carry the mail between here and South Pass," he began, his voice growing stronger. "I see a lot, hear a lot. I knew Elias. He was a good man, a troubled man, but a good one." He took a deep breath. "About a year ago, I was at the trading post. Elias was there with a friend. They didn't see me. They were talking. And Elias, he was talking about this town, about his life, and he said something I never forgot." Orville looked directly at the crowd, his gaze finally landing on Clara. He said, "That woman, Clara, she's the most beautiful wound I've ever carried." He said she was the only person who'd ever seen him for who he really was. A stunned silence fell over the room. The words were so intimate, so full of a painful, poetic truth that they cut through the layers of gossip and slander. They were Elias's words, and they painted a picture not of a seductress and her victim, but of a profound, agonizing connection. "That's not all," Orville said, pressing his advantage. "A month before he disappeared, Elias gave me a package to deliver. It was a bank draft for $1,000. He told me to give it directly to Clara Martin and to do it quietly." The amount was staggering. A gasp rippled through the hall. "What happened to it?" Micah asked, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "It never got to her," Orville said, and now he turned his gaze to the back of the room, where a figure had been standing in the shadows by the door. "Because before I could deliver it, I was met on the road by Jedediah Rutherford. He knew about the draft. He told me that if I delivered it, he would see to it that I lost my mail contract and was run out of the territory on a charge of theft. He took the draft from me. He said he would handle it." Every eye in the room now swung from Orville to the imposing figure of Jedediah Rutherford, who had been forced to step into the light by the accusation. His face was a thundercloud of rage. "This is an outrageous lie," he boomed, his voice accustomed to quelling all dissent. "This man is a nobody, a rumor monger." "Then it's his word against mine," a clear, cold voice said. June stepped out of the shadows, moving to the front of the hall. She looked directly at her father, her face pale but resolute. The townspeople shrunk back, shocked. The wronged widow was here, but she was not playing the part they had assigned her. "My father is the liar," she said, her voice ringing with a strength no one in Redemption had ever heard from her before. "I have here a letter, written by my husband on the day he died. A letter confessing that his heart belonged to Clara Martin. A letter confessing that his life with me was a duty, not a choice." She held up the paper, but she didn't read from it. She didn't need to. Her words were enough. She turned her cold, furious gaze upon her father. "You intercepted that money, didn't you?" she demanded. "Just like you intercepted every chance he had at happiness. You controlled him. You bought him. Tell them why. Father, tell them the truth." "June, you are hysterical. This is nonsense," he blustered, but his composure was cracking. He was a man who had never been publicly challenged, and he was crumbling under the assault from his own daughter. "Tell them," June's voice rose, cracking like a whip. "Tell them how your great and powerful ranch was on the verge of bankruptcy. Tell them about the bad investments and the loans you couldn't repay. Tell them about the deal you made." The color drained from Jedediah's face. The town was silent, every person leaning forward. Their hunger for scandal now turned on the man they had always feared and respected. "Elias's father had passed," June continued, relentlessly. "He had come into a small inheritance, just enough to save you, and that was the price, wasn't it? He would give you the money to save your precious honor, to save this ranch, and in exchange, he would marry me. He would chain himself to our name, to our lie, for the rest of his life." Jedediah Rutherford looked around at the faces staring at him, no longer with deference, but with a dawning, greedy understanding. The power he had held over them for decades was evaporating before his eyes. His face, once so imperious, sagged with the weight of his exposure. It was a business arrangement. He finally choked out. The words a confession. A mutually beneficial arrangement to protect the family. The truth, sordid and pathetic, was finally out. Elias had not married June for her wealth and status. He had married her to save her family from ruin. He had not been a philanderer who had betrayed a loving wife. He had been a man sold into a gilded cage. And Clara was not a homewrecker. She was the woman he had been forced to leave behind. The entire narrative that Redemption had built and nurtured collapsed in an instant. The trial of Clara Martin had become the trial of Jedediah Rutherford. The crowd began to murmur. The whispers now directed not at the woman on the hill, but at the powerful man in their midst whose entire life was a carefully constructed lie. The hearing was over. It had dissolved into chaos. Preacher Thompson and Mr. Abernathy stood on the dais, mouths agape. Their authority vanished. In the center of the storm, Clara stood beside Micah, watching as the town turned on its former king. She looked over at June, who stood alone, looking not triumphant, but simply, finally, free. The truth hadn't brought peace, but it had brought a brutal, cleansing justice. And for the first time, the ground beneath Clara's feet felt solid. The town hall did not empty in an orderly fashion. It broke apart, the crowd dissolving into stunned, murmuring clusters that shuffled out into the cold night, avoiding the eyes of Jedediah Rutherford. The great patriarch of redemption stood exposed, his power stripped away not by a gun or a fist, but by the simple, undeniable weight of the truth. He looked old, shrunken, a hollowed-out monolith in the flickering lantern light. June stood apart from him, her face a mask of grim resolve. She had not won a victory. She had merely survived a war, and the battlefield was her own family. For Clara, the moment was not one of triumph. There was no elation, no sense of vindication. There was only a vast, aching exhaustion. The town's opinion, which had swung from contempt to condemnation and now to a sort of grudging, shame-faced pity, meant nothing to her. Their judgment was a weather vane, spinning in whatever direction the most powerful wind blew. She had not been proven innocent. Jedediah Rutherford had simply been proven guilty. It was a subtle but crucial distinction. Redemption was not a place of forgiveness. It was a place that had simply found a new, more satisfying sinner to flay. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in town shifted. People who had once crossed the street to avoid her now offered her hesitant, awkward nods, misses. Gable was suddenly consumed with a church charity drive for orphans in the East and seemed not to see Clara at all. Mr. Abernathy, his face a miserable portrait of humiliation, sent word via a young boy that her lease was, of course, valid for as long as she wished to stay. The reversal was total, and it felt utterly false. Their politeness was a flimsy bandage over a festering wound. The ground here was poisoned with the memory of their cruelty, and nothing could make it fertile again. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she could not stay. To remain in redemption would be to live forever as a monument to the town's shame and Elias's tragedy. Samuel would grow up as the boy from the scandal, his life defined by a story that was not his own. The West had been a crucible, a place that had forged her into someone stronger. But it was not a home. Home was a place of peace, and peace was the one thing this land would never offer her. She made her decision quietly. Without fanfare, she would go east, back to a world of crowded cities, of paved streets and noise, a world where a woman and her son could disappear, their past a story they could choose never to tell. She sold her few meager possessions, the spare pots, the patched-up furniture, to a trapper passing through. She used the small amount of money, along with the savings she had guarded so fiercely, to buy 2 one-way tickets on the Union Pacific Railroad. Micah watched her preparations with a quiet, sorrowful understanding. He did not try to dissuade her. He was a man of the West. He understood the need to move on, to find fresh ground. He helped her, his presence a silent, constant support. He fixed the wheel on her small cart, packed her belongings into sturdy wooden crates, and ensured she had enough dried meat and flour for the journey to the train station. He spoke little, but his every action was an expression of a deep, unspoken grief at her leaving. The night before she was to depart was still and cold. The cabin was almost entirely empty, a hollow shell echoing with the ghosts of the past 5 years. Her 2 trunks and a single satchel stood by the door, ready for the morning. A single oil lamp cast a pool of warm, flickering light in the center of the room, pushing back against the immense, encroaching darkness of the prairie. Samuel was asleep in the corner, bundled in a nest of blankets, dreaming of the great iron horse he would ride on the morrow. Clara sat on a wooden crate, staring into the lamp's flame. When Micah entered without knocking, He had been checking on her horse, but she knew he had come for another reason. He carried the chill of the night in with him, but also a warmth that was entirely his own. He stood for a moment in the doorway, his broad shoulders seeming to fill the entire frame. "Everything's ready," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "Thank you, Micah," she said, not looking up from the flame. "For everything, I could never have—" Her voice trailed off. There were no words sufficient for the debt she owed him. He walked over and sat on another crate opposite her, the small lamp the only thing between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of their imminent parting. He had saved her son. He had stood for her when no one else would. He had shown her a kindness so steady and so unconditional it had slowly, painstakingly, rebuilt her faith in the existence of good men. "You're sure about this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "The town, they've changed their tune. The town is a choir that sings whatever song the richest man pays for," she replied, a weary bitterness in her voice. "Their tune will change again with the next wind. I can't raise my son in a place like this. He deserves a life where his name is his own, not an echo of his father's." Micah nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her face. "He was a good man, Elias," he said quietly. "Lost, but good." "I know," she whispered. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the soft hiss of the lamp. The past hung between them, a shared, acknowledged ghost. But as Clara looked at Micah's face in the warm, dancing light, at his steady eyes, the kind lines around his mouth, the quiet strength in the set of his jaw, she realized that the ghost was fading. The sharp, aching memory of Elias was becoming a dull, distant sorrow. The man before her was not a memory. He was real. He was solid. He was here. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I will miss you, Clara." The simple word struck her with a surprising force. "And I you, Micah." He stood then, and she thought he was going to leave, but instead, he took the 2 steps that separated them and stood before her. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, slowly, gently, he reached out and laid his hand against her cheek. His hand was calloused and rough from a lifetime of hard work, but his touch was incredibly soft. It was not the desperate, fevered touch of a man taking solace, like Elias's had been. It was the deliberate, tender touch of a man who was choosing to give comfort. The warmth of his palm spread through her, chasing away the deep, perpetual chill she had carried for years. It was the first time a man had touched her with such reverence, such simple, unadorned affection. Her eyes fluttered shut. In that single, gentle touch, she felt something she had not felt in years, something she had never truly expected to feel again, the feeling of being chosen, not stumbled upon, not saved out of necessity, but seen and valued and chosen. He leaned down, and she tilted her head up to meet him. Their kiss was not a spark of sudden passion. It was slow and deep and searching. It was a question and an answer all at once. For Clara, it was a moment of profound revelation. For the first time in years, she let her instincts guide her, let herself be present in a moment without the shadow of the past looming over it. This was not about the memory of Elias. It was about the reality of Micah. It was about the electric, life-affirming connection with the man who stood before her. It was about survival. It was about the fierce, undeniable will to live, to feel, to connect, after so much loss and loneliness. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers in the lamplight, giving her a chance to retreat. She gave him his answer by leaning in and kissing him again, this time with a lifetime of pent-up sorrow and a burgeoning, desperate hope. They came together that night not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate unfolding. It was an act of profound intimacy, gentle and deep, in the cold, empty cabin. surrounded by the ghosts of a life she was about to leave behind. They found a fierce, desperate warmth in each other's arms. It was a communion of two lonely, scarred souls who had weathered the same storm from different shores and had finally found a shared harbor. For Clara, it was a reclamation. She was not replacing Elias. She was accepting that she, Clara Martin, a woman who had been cast out and condemned, was worthy of a new happiness. She was worthy of this quiet, steady man, and worthy of the simple, honest desire that flowed between them. It was a quiet, healing passion. A silent promise that even after the harshest winter, life could and would begin again. The next morning, the world was bright and cold. The sound of the eastbound train's whistle echoed from the distance, a mournful, lonely cry that signaled the arrival of her future. Samuel was awake and buzzing with excitement, dressed in his best patched-up clothes. Clara was ready, her bonnet tied, her satchel in her hand. Micah was there, his horse saddled, ready to take them to the station. He did not speak of the night before, but a new, deeper understanding resided in the quiet space between them. His eyes, when they met hers, were full of a profound sadness, but also a quiet, respectful acceptance of her choice. He loaded her trunks onto the small cart. "It's time," he said softly. Clara took Samuel's hand and walked to the cabin door. She paused on the threshold, turning to take one last look at the empty room that had been her prison and her sanctuary. She looked at the bare walls, the cold hearth, the spot on the floor where she and Micah had found each other. Then she looked outside, past Micah, to the vast, open prairie stretching out under the enormous sky. The train whistle blew again, closer this time. A long, insistent summons. It was the sound of escape, the sound of a new beginning. Samuel tugged at her hand, eager to go. She looked at Micah, at his strong, patient face. She looked at her son, his eyes bright with the promise of an adventure. And she looked at the land, this hard, unforgiving, beautiful land that had taken so much from her, but had also, in the end, given her a strength she never knew she possessed. She had made her decision to leave because she felt she had to run away from the judgment, from the ghosts, from the pain. But standing here now, in the clear morning light, with a good man by her side and her healthy son's hand in hers, she realized a profound truth. She didn't have to run anymore. "Clara?" Micah asked, his voice gentle, questioning. The train was waiting. She took a deep breath of the crisp, clean air. "I'm not going," she said, her voice quiet, but filled with a certainty that was absolute. He stared at her, his heart in his eyes. "Why?" She turned her gaze from him to the endless horizon, to the sunlight glinting on the new spring grass. A slow, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "Because I don't have to," she said. She was not staying for the town, or even for Micah. She was staying for herself, because for the first time in her life, she was not a fugitive from her past, but the master of her future. And she chose for it to begin right here. A year passed. Spring returned to the high plains, not with the violent, muddy rush of the year before, but with a gentle, pervasive warmth that coaxed the new grass from the earth and painted the hillsides with the delicate colors of wildflowers. The wind, which had once been Clara's tormentor, now carried the sweet scent of sage and damp soil. It was a season of healing, a quiet absolution granted by the land itself. The cabin on the edge of town was no longer a leaning, desperate hovel. It was a home. Micah, with his patient, capable hands, had rebuilt the roof, squared the walls, and added a proper porch where Clara could sit in the evenings. He had built a sturdy new corral for their 2 horses and had cultivated a small garden where green shoots were already pushing their way toward the sun. He and Clara lived in the quiet, comfortable rhythm of a husband and wife. Though no preacher had spoken words over them and no paper had been signed, their union was a simple fact, a partnership forged not in a church, but in the crucible of a desperate winter. It was a bond of mutual respect and a deep, unspoken affection that needed no public validation. Samuel, now a sturdy 6-year-old, was unrecognizable from the pale, fragile child he had been. The shadow of the fever had long since receded, replaced by a sun-browned vitality. He spent his days with Micah, his small frame trotting to keep up with the man's long strides. Micah was teaching him about horses, about tracking, about the language of the land. In the quiet cowboy, Samuel had found a father, and in the boy, Micah had found a focus for his steady, protective nature. The sound of their shared laughter, carried on the wind from the corral, was the constant, reassuring music of Clara's new life. The town of Redemption had settled into a new, more subdued reality. Jedediah Rutherford was a recluse, his power broken, his name a quiet shame. The townspeople treated Clara with a distant, cautious respect. They left her alone, which was the only thing she had ever asked of them. She was no longer a pariah, nor was she a curiosity. She was simply Clara Martin, the woman on the hill, a quiet fixture in the landscape, as unremarkable and as permanent as the cottonwoods by the creek. One bright afternoon in late May, Clara was on the new porch, mending a tear in one of Samuel's shirts, when she saw a lone rider approaching. It was a woman, and as she drew closer, Clara recognized the straight-backed posture and the fine, chestnut mare. It was June. Clara felt no fear, no anxiety. The past year had leached the poison from that relationship, leaving only a strange, quiet sense of connection. She set aside her sewing and stood, waiting, as June dismounted and tied her horse to the fence post Micah had recently installed. June looked well. Her face had regained its color, and the haunted, brittle look in her eyes had been replaced by a calm, settled maturity. She carried a small, leather-bound book in her hand. "Clara," she said, her voice a simple, friendly greeting. "June, it's good to see you. Will you take some tea?" "Thank you, I will," June replied, ascending the porch steps. They sat together in 2 sturdy chairs Micah had built, sipping hot tea in a comfortable silence. They spoke of the weather, of the price of cattle, of the simple, ordinary things that fill the days. The ghosts of the past did not seem to be present. Finally, June placed the leather-bound book on the small table between them. "I came to bring you this," she said. "Our old gardener found it. It was at the bottom of a trunk of Elias's things from before we were married. It's his journal." Clara looked at the book. It was small, the leather worn smooth with time. It looked harmless, but she knew it was anything but. It was the final, locked room of Elias's heart. "Have you read it?" she asked softly. June shook her head. "No, I started to, but I realized it wasn't just my story to read. He belonged to both of us. In his way, I thought we should read it together." It was an offering of profound trust, the final act in the long, painful journey from rivals to something akin to kin. Clara nodded, her throat tight. "All right," she whispered. And so, as the afternoon sun slanted across the porch, the 2 women who had loved Elias Rutherford opened his journal. June read the first entry, her voice clear and steady, and then she passed the book to Clara, who read the next. They passed it back and forth, their voices weaving together to give sound to the silent, secret thoughts of the man who had defined both their lives. The journal was not a chronicle of events, but a map of a restless soul. They read of his youth, of his chafing against his father's expectations, of his deep love for the untamed wilderness. They read of the war, of the brother he had lost, and of the profound guilt he carried, a debt of blood he felt he could never repay. He wrote of his return to a world that no longer made sense, of feeling like a ghost in his own life. They found themselves within its pages. He wrote of June with a kind of baffled admiration, calling her a perfect porcelain doll in a world of mud and stone. So beautiful, so fine, I am terrified I will break her, or that she will see that I am nothing but mud and stone myself. He wrote of his marriage as a port in a storm, but my ship was never meant for a harbor. It was the confession of a man who respected, and perhaps even cared for his wife, but who knew from the start that he could not truly love her in the way she deserved. When they came to the entries from 5 years before, Clara's hands trembled as she took the book. He did not write of her by name. She was the woman in the cabin, the quiet one with the sad eyes, the only soul who has ever looked at me without wanting something. He wrote of the blizzard, of being nursed back to health, of the profound, terrifying peace he felt in her small cabin. In her silence, Clara read aloud, her voice thick with emotion. I hear a song my own soul has been trying to sing. It is a song of loneliness, but also of a strength so deep and quiet it frightens me. To stay would be to cage her wild, sad spirit with my own broken one. To leave is to tear out my own heart. I do not know which is the greater sin. June reached out and placed her hand over Clara's. They sat in silence for a moment. Two women weeping silently for the man they were only now, in death, truly beginning to understand. He had not been a coward or a hero. He had simply been a man, torn apart by his own contradictions, trying to navigate a life for which he had no map. They read until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. The final entry was dated the day before he rode into the mountains. I am going to settle the old debt, June read, her voice a near whisper. The one for Jacob. There is a man in those mountains, a man who should have died in my place. Perhaps one of us will walk away. It does not matter which. My life has been a series of wrong turns. Perhaps this last ride will finally lead me somewhere true. Tell C that she was the only true place I ever found, and tell J that I am sorry she ever had to look upon a fraud like me. June closed the book. The story was over. All the secrets had been told. There was no anger left, no bitterness. There was only a vast, quiet sadness, and a profound sense of peace. They had finally seen the whole of the man, his flaws, his regrets, his tortured love, and in seeing him, they had finally, truly, set him free. June stood to leave as the first stars pricked the twilight sky. Thank you, Clara, she said. It was a thank you that encompassed everything. Be well, June, Clara replied. She watched as June rode away, a solitary figure disappearing into the growing darkness. She did not feel a sense of loss. She felt a sense of completion. Clara turned and went back inside the cabin, which was filled with the warm, comforting smell of the stew she had left simmering on the hearth. She took the old, worn sheepskin jacket down from its shelf. For a year, it had sat there, a silent monument to the past. She ran her hand over the soft, frayed collar, the cold, smooth leather. She could no longer smell him on it. The scent of pine and leather had been replaced by the scent of her own home, wood smoke, baking bread, and the faint, clean smell of lavender from the sachets she kept in her trunk. It was no longer a vessel for a ghost. It was just a jacket, with slow, deliberate movements. She laid it on the table. She smoothed the wrinkles from its sleeves. She folded one side over the other, then folded it in half again. Her movements neat and precise. It was not an act of banishment, but one of tenderness. She was not casting out the memory, but putting it to rest. The past was no longer a wild, untamed thing to be wrestled with or mourned. It was a story that had been told, a chapter that was now closed. She placed the folded jacket into the bottom of her wooden chest, laid a clean linen cloth over it, and closed the lid. She stepped out onto the porch, drawn by the sound of Micah's steady hammering. He was down by the corral, mending a section of the fence, his silhouette a dark, solid shape against the star-dusted sky. He was not a ghost or a dream. He was a real, tangible presence, building a life with her, one nail at a time. She wrapped her arms around herself, breathing in the cool, clean night air. She looked out over the vast, dark prairie, no longer seeing it as a place of exile or danger, but as a place of profound, quiet beauty, a place of beginnings. The vastness no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like possibility. Micah looked up from his work and saw her standing there. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that reached his eyes, and for the first time in her life, a smile answered on Clara's lips that was born not of relief, not of fleeting pleasure, but of a deep, abiding peace. It was a smile without a shadow, a smile without fear. Thank you for listening to this story from our collection. We're curious to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts with our community.